I welcome you to the 10th meeting in 2020 of Scotland's Social Security Committee. With no apologies this morning. Mr Balfour thinks having some IT issues. He'll join us shortly, but other than that, we will have our full house this morning. And can I, as I have done privately just before the start of the broadcast, thank the Clarkin team, broadcasters and witnesses for making every effort to make sure this committee can take place this morning. So thank you to everyone. We now move to agenda item 1, which is the decision to take items number 3, which are consideration of evidence will hear today, and item number 4, the committee's annual report in private. And we'll get to those agenda items. Given the technical issues with broadcast, unless I hear anyone objecting just now, I'll take that as agreed by the MSPs. I'll just give a few seconds. Okay, thank you for agreeing to that, and we now move to agenda item 2, which is consideration of evidence at stage 1 of the Social Security Administration and Tribunal Membership Scotland Bill. And can I thank Craig Smith, Public Affairs Officer, Scottish Association for Mental Health, SAMH, and John Shaw, Welfare Rights Advisor, Child Poverty Action Group, CPAG, for joining us this morning. So good morning, gentlemen. I know it's been a bit of a truncated process looking at this bill, but you're very welcome this morning, so thank you for joining us. And we'll move to Alison Johnson for the first question. Alison.
Convener, and thank you very much to our witnesses for joining us. I would just like to, with regards to the procedure for appointees, I know it's not a concern that you raised, but the Law Society of Scotland, they certainly raised concerns, and I know that you have too, but I think they have looked at what is proposed and think that there aren't sufficient safeguards that exist for similar purposes in other laws, such as the Adults with Incapacity Act, and they have concerns about whether or not the current proposals are compliant with the European Convention on Human Rights and with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I just wondered if your organisations had any concerns in that regard, if that was something you'd looked at. Thank you.
So, Craig, do you want to comment on that?
And seen those concerns. It's not something I feel I could give a detailed response on. We are obviously keeping in mind that Adults with Incapacity law is due to be reviewed at some point in the coming future. It's obviously an area that we keep an eye on. I couldn't give you an example. It's not an issue that we raise with us about appointeeship in that regard. Obviously, we have concerns which we'll get onto on the specific proposals for this piece of legislation, and there is always a concern about the need for safeguards to ensure that people who are lacking capacity aren't exploited and that appointees are working in their best interest. But I couldn't give you any kind of clear examples about our concerns around incapacity law as it currently stands, so I wouldn't want to say anything just kind of off the top of my head there.
Okay, thank you. And John Shaw, we'll just give you the opportunity to comment on that. Just a little note, when we do come to you, just give a second or two to let the broadcast get the microphone to you. John Shaw.
Thank you. Yeah, so having looked at the Law Society's evidence, the obvious one is Article 6, right to a fair trial. We did raise in our evidence the lack of a dispute resolution for somebody who doesn't agree that there should be an appointee, or for someone who's incapable, as defined in the Adults with Incapacity Act, whether they're able to have any recourse to an independent challenge. So I think the Law Society raises a valid concern. It's important to note that that is also a concern with the current appointee system that the DWP have. And as they signpost, the Adults with Incapacity Act does give right to recourse to the sheriff if somebody has a concern about whether an appointeeship is appropriate. It's important to acknowledge there's a balance between the difficulty of the process and the so between the Sorry, that was a cat. The difficulty of the process for administrative purposes, because the power of attorney guardianship procedures are much more labour intensive for the people making decisions. But at the same time, whilst there are a few disputes in the current system, we do have evidence of there being disputes, and when those disputes do happen, that is very difficult for people. So we do think that there should be a way to get some kind of independent resolution.
Okay, thank you. Alison, do you want to follow up on any of that?
Just perhaps to ask Mr. Shaw's views on how that resolution might best be achieved.
Mr. Shaw.
So I think that is a question that perhaps we're not best placed to answer given our expertise in social security law, but the Adults with Incapacity Act does give access to the Sheriff Court, and in terms of the proposals around children, there is obviously a separate children's hearing system. So there are forums which already exist in Scotland for resolving disputes around rights of people with disabilities and rights of children. I think that those could be considered. I think Craig Smith's point that the Adults with Incapacity Act is itself being reviewed is important, so whether that could be tied in. And I suppose the other option would be to come up with a novel method of resolving those disputes in the same way that these proposals are novel and are unfamiliar from the current social security law.
Thank you, John. Alison, anything to add?
No, that's very helpful. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Graham Simpson, followed by Keith Brown.
Thank you, Convener. So I've got questions for both witnesses, so I need to get your names right, gents. So if we come to Craig first, from the Scottish Association for Mental Health. I'm just basing this on what you've sent the committee, so I'll just ask you to expand on it. I'll just read out what you've sent us on appointees. It says the political memorandum to the bill provides suggested circumstances where a claimant with capacity may wish to appoint another adult to act on their behalf. The examples given relate to a claimant with a terminal illness or for other personal reasons unable to act on their own behalf. You go on to say that there should be clear, detailed guidance and advice around this. So I wonder if you can expand on that and say what kind of guidance and advice you'd be looking for. Should that be on the face of the bill, or should that be in regulations?
Yes, so I think our concern around the appointeeship, particularly for people with capacity, is, for one, it's a novel thing. It doesn't exist in the DWP system, as far as I'm aware, and it's not clear from the bill itself and the political memorandum or explanatory note in what circumstances that be used. I mean, as a principle, we are in favour of that, where someone really, they cannot manage their own social security claim and would like someone to do that on their behalf. That is a good proposal, but an appointee will have significant information about that person, significant powers around completing an individual's claim, processing a claim, possible payment. So it's a big responsibility, and it's difficult for us to think about in what circumstances that would be appropriate. So terminal illness, which is given as an example in the political memorandum, that does seem to make sense, particularly if you tie this in with the non-disclosure of harmful health information, which we have some concerns around. So we definitely like detailed guidance about situations where an appointee would be appropriate, and particularly we're talking here about people with capacity. So I think there's a much clearer rationale for people who lack capacity about the requirement for appointeeship, which is obviously already in the existing Social Security Act. But yeah, guidance about when that would be appropriate, and we imagine it would be very limited situations, and the most important aspect of this would be the safeguards that people would have. So to ensure that people aren't exploited, to ensure that an appointee is appropriate. So currently in the DWP system, for people who lack capacity, the individual would be interviewed, the proposed appointee would be interviewed. So safeguards like that, I think are essential to be in place just to ensure, because someone has such significant powers when they're an appointee, that they are appropriate and they are working in the best interests of the individual. Obviously, the individual should retain their rights to advocacy, and we do welcome that they can, if they have capacity, they can remove their consent for an appointeeship at any point. But there needs to be clear guidance given to the individual at all points of the process around their powers to withhold consent and remove consent and access to advocacy. So in terms of where that should sit on the bill, I mean, we generally like a lot of stuff to be in primary or secondary legislation just to give it that legal status. When we're talking about detailed guidance, that probably isn't appropriate to be on the face of the bill. But I think what could be on the face of the bill, or at least in secondary legislation, would be a mandate that the Scottish Government needs to develop guidance around safeguards around appointeeships and where appointeeships are appropriate. And as I said in the previous question, dispute resolution too. So we don't need the details of that in the bill, but a provision ensuring that the Scottish Government does develop those would be helpful.
Graham, yes.
Yeah, I think that's very useful. Thank you very much. If I could just have a question for John. I'll just ask the two questions because I know time is very short, convener. So John, from Child Poverty Action Group, you've sent us quite a detailed submission. It's really useful, but you've got a lot to say on this appointee section. And if I can just read out, if I do that again, what you sent. You say, whilst an individual with capacity can withdraw consent to an appointee, there is no provision in the Act for individuals judged to be incapable to challenge a decision to appoint someone to act for them, quite a serious point, or resolve disputes between two people that wish to be the appointee. The latter point also applies to the proposal for appointees for children. So again, I guess that's something you'd want to change in the bill. I think part of this process for us is to look for ideas that, you know, if we start to think about amendments, so perhaps you could flesh that out a bit and say what you think may have to change in that section of the bill.
Sure.
Certainly, I think we made the point in our submission that unless there is some change to the face of the bill, it's difficult to see how an independent and disputes process could be introduced through guidance. So I think that point's important to make. In terms of the mechanism to do that, it is important to come back to the fact that this is in effect also a criticism of the DWP system, where there isn't such an independent dispute mechanism. So whether it's considered appropriate to have something similar to the processes and procedures under the Adults with Incapacity Act, or to develop something novel to the Scottish system, perhaps more similar to giving a tribunal jurisdiction to consider whether an appointeeship is appropriate, is a question that will obviously have cost and process implications for Social Security Scotland. But I suppose that what we think is that there should be an attempt made to introduce something like that, and also to allow somebody who has concerns to be able to raise them in a formal way. So our evidence is certainly that when people in the current system do disagree with an appointeeship, want to end an appointeeship, that is the point at which there are difficulties with the DWP system. So we don't have a firm view on what process should be set up for the Scottish system, simply because right now the processes that exist are those which exist in relation to incapacity legislation, but we think the government should be exploring a way to do that.
Anything else, Mr. Simpson, before I bring some of your colleagues in?
No, I really appreciate that, convener, and I see that Jeremy Balfour has now joined us.
Yes, absolutely. Good morning, Jeremy.
Apologies, convener, for my lateness.
That's okay.
Apologies.
No worries. Keith Brown.
Thanks very much. I think my questions have substantially been answered by the previous questions, but I suppose thinking of a recent very high-profile example where a vulnerable adult had her benefits claimed on her behalf by two other adults who very tragically murdered the recipient, but for many, many years were able to continue claiming those benefits. Do the witnesses think there are sufficient safeguards in terms of reviews to stop such an experience happening again?
Perhaps we'll go to Craig Smith first for that, and then we'll take John Shaw after.
I mean, in terms of existing provisions, both at the DWP level or the proposed provisions are here for safeguards, I mean, it kind of goes back to the kind of previous points that I've made and that John's made. I think at the moment those safeguards aren't in place. So we know that there has been cases with the WP system where an appointee has been in receipt of benefits inappropriately. So I would kind of go back to what we've said before, that there definitely needs to be more safeguards in place about, for one, how an appointee is appointed and that they're a suitable person and that there's suitable oversight and interviewing of that individual, that the individual who, if they have capacity, if they don't have capacity, is still provided with information around their rights throughout the process, and definitely agreeing with what John was saying and then a couple of other people submitted evidence about the need for a method for people to raise concerns with the Social Security Agency. They do have concerns that someone who is vulnerable is being exploited by an appointee or by anyone else who is involved in their benefits in Social Security. And I think that is definitely needed, and I think the bill just has no detail about that at the moment. So we'd like to see provisions for that, as I said, in primary legislation, and stipulating that those provisions should be developed either through secondary legislation or in guidance. But I think there does need to be something on the bill ensuring that those provisions are developed. So for us, it's just the lack of safeguards is quite concerning around appointing an appointee and how that's monitored and how people can raise concerns. People are concerned about a vulnerable person or someone themselves is obviously raising concerns about themselves too. And I think having access to advocacy is key to that as well.
Big John Shaw.
Yeah, so largely agree with what Craig has said. I think right now the process that Social Security Scotland has introduced, as I understand it, is that they simply automatically accept a DWP appointeeship. So import that lack of a formal review mechanism into the Scottish social security system. One advantage that what the DWP have put in place is that there's very detailed guidance about processes around different legal powers, around how they interact with appointeeships, and that's published and available to the public. So I certainly think that ideally we'd be looking for something on the face of the bill to indicate that there's an attempt to improve on the DWP system, but whatever the outcome is, the other vital thing is that what Social Security Scotland staff are using to make those decisions is publicly available, because that is something else which will give people a confidence in how they're able to exercise those rights. So in addition to the process for reviewing, I think what's really important is that there's a transparent, publicly accessible information about how that process works and how people can engage with it.
Keith, do you want to follow up on that?
Thanks, convener. Just to say that I understand the safeguards which have been mentioned about making sure the person appointed is the right person and all those checks, and also the ability for people to raise concerns. I suppose it's more to do with the fact that the agency should be obliged to do periodic reviews, because that is the safeguard against long-term continuing abuse. But I'm happy to take these issues up with the Cabinet Secretary, Convener. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Pauline McNeill, I don't know if there's anything you want to add in this section, or you've got an interest in relation to appointees?
Yes, thank you, Convener. I would comment, it seems quite a significant omission from what I've read and what I've been hearing this morning, the lack of a dispute resolution. I'm a bit concerned by the fact that it doesn't seem to be clear, and they still have this question of whether it should be in regulation or in guidance. So, Child Poverty Action Group, in your submission, you highlight the example of shared parenting, and it looks really complicated because where, I suppose in Scotland, just because someone has the child resident with them, they still be sharing the parenting, and one could have the child benefit while the other could have the other benefits. I just wondered, should there be some more basic criteria in case of children about who the appointee should be? I mean, the issues that we should need to concern ourselves with, what happens while there is a dispute over who the appointee is? Are there temporary arrangements for that? I just wondered what the witnesses both thought about that. There seems to be quite a large issue to clear up. And if what we're hearing from Craig Smith and John Shaw is that, well, we could look to the DWP arrangements or the adults with incapacity, which is currently being reviewed. I mean, it strikes me as that's not really going to be adequate if one act is under review and perhaps the DWP process isn't that satisfactory either. I wonder if the witnesses thought we really need to ask ministers to concentrate on this section of the bill to make sure that we get it right. And a second question is, well, should there be some guidance and criteria in the cases of children as to which member of the family it would be, I suppose, first in line, second in line? I don't know. I'm just concerned that there could be potential disputes all over the place, given there's quite a lot of money involved. Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. Should we take John Shaw first on this occasion? John, any comments on that?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really valid concern, and I think it's important to acknowledge that there is a fundamental difference in policy approach between the DWP and the proposal in this bill. So the DWP's approach is that any child who's under 16 automatically has an appointee, and the starting point is the person the child lives with. So as I understand it, the policy intent is minimal regulation in this proposal, and that gives a discretion to appoint someone to act, but not a duty to appoint someone to act. So we understand the Scottish Government know that anyone who is someone with parental rights and responsibilities has the right to act as a child's legal representative. So I think the thing is, in terms of the proposal for children, it leaves more uncertain when an appointee will be appointed, and it also doesn't give such a kind of clear steer as to what the order of priority would be. So again, we cited some case evidence of difficulties in relation to shared care of children. So the DWP hasn't resolved those with a formal dispute mechanism. But the approach the Scottish Government has chosen to take perhaps does increase the uncertainty in that where there is someone with parental rights and responsibilities, it's not clear how somebody who a child normally lives with would take over responsibility for that claim. Not sure if that's helpful.
Thank you, John. And Craig Smith.
I mean, basically, I agree with John's point. I mean, I don't have much to add on the children and young people's aspect, except that there is a real need for clarity around that will work, particularly, the vulnerabilities of children. So there does need to be clear guidance and clarity about appointeeships and what is the order of preference of where someone becomes an appointeeship. I think a kind of general point around this, I think Colin, you're right that this is, for us, this is the key issue in the bill, around the appointeeships and the non-disclosure of harmful information, and we do think that it does need some more scrutiny from the Scottish Government, but also we suggested that this area around appointees, particularly for people with capacity, but also aligned to that in the non-disclosure of harmful information, which is a significant power about non-disclosing information to claimants, be scrutinised by the experience panel, so people with lived experience of social security, as well as Disability and Carers Benefits Expert Working Group. If I got that right, DACB. So many acronyms in this. But that working group's already set up to give advice to ministers on disability and carers benefits, and I think this would be an area about what's the safeguarding proposals, which obviously there's not much detail on the bill at all around appointeeships, but I think the whole areas around how we safeguard that, around non-disclosure information, would be really good for DACB and the panel to be able to look at that and provide their insight to help shape this, and particularly help shape the guidance going forward when that's developed.
Okay, thank you, Jake Smith. Is there anything further, Pauline, you want to put on there?
Yes, Convener, I really just wanted to conclude by asking the witnesses whether a way forward might be, so if the DWP way of doing it, I feel like, seems quite sensible in the case of children with two parents, for example, would be a good starting point, so whoever the child lives with. Obviously, there needs to be scope for that to be overturned, and there might be an argument to say that perhaps a child aged 12, 13, 14 might have somebody challenge that on their behalf, old enough to or have capacity. Why shouldn't they be able to challenge it? And then to add in Keith Brown's point seems a sensible one, to have some periodic review. I don't know who would do that, but I just wondered if you thought that is a better starting point to get that into the legislation.
Yep. Yeah, that's very helpful, Pauline. Jake Smith and then John Shaw.
I'll probably, in terms of the children's point, it's not an area of my expertise, so I'll probably defer to John on that. But I do think reviews is a sensible approach going forward, and obviously taking learning from the DWP process where that is working, and building that into the system and building from that. But John probably has more he can offer on the children point.
John Shaw?
Yeah, so from discussions with officials, they've indicated that they think that children are essentially largely prevented from applying. We think this is about the Age of Legal Capacity Act, which is a 1991 statute, which is still enforced in Scotland. But that isn't made clear on the face of the bill, and I think because it isn't made clear on the face of the bill, it does leave an uncertainty there. So in terms of whether a child should be able to challenge an appointeeship, again, that comes back to a meaningful dispute process. But I think the other side of that is that there is a provision to take into account the child's views so far as reasonably practicable, which does suggest that, for example, where two parents are separating and there's shared care, there could be a situation in which Social Security Scotland could take into account the child's views. But what that doesn't do is it doesn't bind, and it doesn't give a lot of teeth to the child's ability to make their views known. And that is a question in relation to UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So it's clear to see that the Scottish Government is attempting to bring it in the child's views in a way which the DWP doesn't. And I think that this comes back to the point on public consultation. So, for example, the Children's Commissioner and the Youth Parliament themselves and young people would be potentially stakeholders who the Scottish Government should be engaging with in terms of developing proposals around how this should work.
Okay, thank you, John Shaw. Deputy Convener, do you have any follow-up questions on that?
No, thank you very much.
Well, I suppose just before we end this evidence session, I'm just checking in case there's another question from members. I've just got one final question to ask. Don't see anything on we'll get a chat box at the side of our platform where members can indicate when they haven't done so. So I suppose it would just be the very obvious question about as this bill goes through Parliament in a relatively short order, but there's a feeling that there's an essential aspect to this bill to allow matters such as the Scottish Child Payment to proceed in short order, which we're all keen to see. And suggestions have been made this morning about how we can enhance the various other provisions within the bill. It would just be quite good to get on record in general, on balance, whether witnesses are supportive of the bill, with caveats clear that it's been given here this morning, or where there might be any other concerns. That will just help our own scrutiny of it, given that will be quite a limited time period. So maybe just some brief comments from John Shaw and then Craig before we close this particular evidence session. John.
Thank you. I think, the major rationale from the bill in relation to the Scottish Child Payment relates to the lack of explicit authority to create fraud offences. We can see the argument for consistency between devolved benefits, but I think it's important to note that, as our evidence on the previous Social Security bill made clear, we have concerns with the Scottish Government's approach to frauds in the Scottish Social Security system. It is also important to note, I think our written submission raised something which isn't on the face of the bill, which is around suspension of payments. So when we look at the child disability payment regulations, it's quite clear that at present the drafting suggests that you cannot separate entitlement from payability. And there were two key issues that we could see with that, which relate to children in residential care, where if their payment stops, their entitlement ends. And this means that as things stand, they can't qualify for additional support from the DWP in terms of disabled child elements. So we know that officials are working with the DWP on that, but a simple and a tried and tested solution would simply be to have a power to separate entitlement and payability. And that would also help with issues where someone's entitled to two different types of benefits. So an example which will come up in the coming years is carer's allowance and the state pension. So if you lose your entitlement to carer's allowance, when you start getting a state pension, that's going to have an impact on passported DWP entitlements. So I suppose we accept the need for amendments to the Social Security Scotland Act 2018, but I think our view would be that the more important amendment in terms of how we can make those draft regulations we've also already seen work for people is actually bringing in a power to suspend payments. And I think the other one to note is that if somebody isn't engaging with a review of their disability benefit entitlement at present, the options are just to stop benefit, to make someone claim again, challenge the decision to stop their benefit. Whereas if they've simply, their address has gone awry on Social Security Scotland's computers, then suspending their benefit, prompting them to get in touch without the need for a new claim would be a real advantage and perhaps better for claimants than having to make a new claim. So I think, yeah, we accept that there needs to change to the primary legislation, but perhaps we'd have prioritised that aspect over the rationale for the Scottish Child Payment, certainly.
I was taking lots of notes during that, Mr. Shaw. That's quite helpful, but I suppose what we're hearing is the bill is fine as far as it goes, but you've identified certain areas where you would want greater scrutiny and greater improvement in this bill, or the Scottish Government to return to it more generally at a later date. I think you mentioned in particular, you don't have to get into it just now, but fraud provisions in general across a number of areas is something that the government could look at again more generally as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to note that we absolutely support the focus on prioritising the Scottish Child Payment and introducing that as soon as possible. Us and some other groups have written to the First Minister indicating that regardless of this bill, we think that there are things that should be done now to support families. So given that the Cabinet Secretary has already confirmed that the Scottish Child Payment as it's being developed, can't be introduced on the previous timescales. That potentially gives the ability to scrutinise the proposals in this bill more, and to perhaps take a little bit more time, because as I understand it currently, it's not expected that anyone will be able to apply for the Scottish Child Payment until December at the earliest. So that is a greater window to increase the scrutiny of these proposals, both around appointees and also around other areas of the bill that could benefit from amendment before we get into delivering those benefits that we now know aren't expected in 2020.
Craig Smith, we'll take you in a little second. Just it might be worth putting on the record at this point, Mr. Shaw, that the committee, I did write on behalf of the committee to the Cabinet Secretary for Social Security, saying we were, despite the fact there had been unavoidable slippage in the delivery of Scottish Child Payment, we were keen to get this legislation as robust as possible, obviously, Mr. Shaw, passed as quickly as possible, because we'd hate for there to be an opportunity to bring it in a little bit quicker. If this legislation hadn't passed its course through Parliament, then it could be delayed. So that might be quite a helpful thing just to put on the record just now. But some really, really helpful comments there, John Shaw, so thank you very much. Craig Smith.
Yeah, I mean, following from John and from our written evidence, we are generally in favour of the bill. So we understand the rationale for the kind of truncated timescale for the legislation, particularly in aligning with the Scottish Child Payment. So we definitely understand the rationale why this is on such a quick timescale. Obviously, we want the legislation to be as robust as possible, and as we've spoken about today, for us, is around the appointeeship. And to quickly mention the non-disclosure of harmful information, I think, is an area that needs to be looked at, which is part of the appointeeship, where someone has an appointee and the bill provides powers for some information about someone's health not to be disclosed to the individual. We think that's a really significant power that needs proper scrutiny. And again, that's similar to the wider appointeeship points. There's not much detail in the face of the bill at all about how that would operate and what circumstances that operates. Again, the political memorandum gives the example of terminal illness, where someone maybe doesn't have a clear understanding of their prognosis, and if they saw some evidence that their GP or consultant gave as part of their claim, that could be incredibly distressing and harmful to them. And we understand that rationale, but that needs to be balanced. The right for someone to have full information about their claim in line with the Charter. And we have some concerns about the scope of that, because the scope hasn't been sketched out very well in the political memorandum in our understanding of it, because it does allow non-disclosure beyond terminal illness. And we'd like to see a wee bit more information around circumstances where that would be, how we're defining harmful and serious harm in terms of that, which again is undefined in the bill. And we know that there is some precedent in mental health legislation where non-disclosure can happen in very limited circumstances. But in those instances, there's clear safeguards around the Mental Welfare Commission, the Mental Health Tribunal being informed about non-disclosure and being given a report. So we think there's probably a role for Social Security Scotland about keeping, having to be informed about non-disclosure and keeping a record of the reasons why non-disclosure of information has happened. So to go back to the main point, yeah, we are broadly in favour of the principles of the bill. It's important. I can see the rationale why it needs to happen and why there needs to be a quick timetable, but that needs to be balanced against proper scrutiny, and obviously we don't want to have flawed legislation kind of rush through. So we do think there does need to be some more detail on the face of the bill, leading to kind of further secondary legislation around appointees and non-disclosure of information.
Okay. Very helpful closing comments from both witnesses. So we very much appreciate that. That ends this particular evidence session, but it doesn't end the committee. We will stay on agenda item 2, and we will hear from the Cabinet Secretary at 10 a.m. This morning. It will give all of us a chance to consider some of the evidence we've heard here this morning for witnesses to be changed around. So for the time being, can I thank Craig Smith and John Shaw for your evidence this morning, and we'll now suspend until 10 o'clock. Thank you, everyone. And welcome back. We are still on agenda item 2, which is the Social Security Administration and Rural Membership Scotland Bill. We have previously heard evidence from SAMH and Child Poverty Action Group, and I'm now pleased to say we can hear evidence from Shirley Ann Sullivan, the Cabinet Secretary for Social Security and Older People, who is joined by Stephanie Vermelijeu, lawyer, and Walter Drummond-Murray, Head of Reserve Tribunals and Civil Court Team Scottish Government, and also Chris Boylan, Bill Manager, Social Security Scotland. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. I know you were able to hear the first evidence session, which was very helpful for the committee. Before we move to questions, Cabinet Secretary, I'm not sure if you prepared an opening statement for the committee, but there'd be an opportunity to do that now if you wish.
Thank you, Convener. I'll be very brief in my opening remarks in this. I'd like to thank the committee for its consideration of this bill on an expedited timeframe. Had it not been for the vital requirement for us to introduce the Scottish Child Payment as soon as possible, then that may not have been required, but it still is, given our government commitment on this issue. The bill also addresses a small number of other issues to ensure the effective implementation of the 2018 Act, which we think is better progressed together rather than separate overlapping bills. As I've said, the Scottish Child Payment is a vitally important benefit, and we are determined to introduce it as quickly as possible, but I will not do so until the statutory offence provisions within this bill are in place. Through the 2018 Social Security Act, we already have provision for adults who need an appointee where they cannot act for themselves, and we're working with stakeholders of how this will work in practice, put in place appropriate and proportionate safeguards, and we will consult on these more fully in due course. Through this bill, we are proposing to make some minor changes by allowing appointees aged 16 or over rather than 18, and allowing adults with capacity to access to an appointee if they wish. We want to ensure that no one's disadvantaged. It's only right that Social Security Scotland can deal with a responsible person on the client's behalf where there is a need. This includes where a child's parent or guardian is unable to act on their behalf. As for other appointee arrangements, we will ensure appropriate safeguards, and we are developing guidance to ensure we have a robust, flexible process that ensures the right to social security is protected. In the very rare cases where a medical professional has decided to withhold information about an individual's health on the basis that to do otherwise would cause serious harm, it's important that Social Security Scotland can also withhold this information. We will only do so where the client's doctor or nurse has advised that disclosure would cause serious harm to that client. While we welcome openness in communications, including with those who have a terminal illness, timing can be critical to ensuring such conversations are sensitive and thoughtful. The Social Security Act in 2018 only allows a registered medical practitioner to clinically determine whether an individual is terminally ill for the purposes of disability assistance, and it's become clear that many registered nurses have the required skills and interactions with a patient to also provide that judgment. On tribunals, the provisions in relation to tribunals will facilitate access to a wider group of experienced judges via the route of temporary authorisation in order to increase the capacity of the Scottish tribunals. Finally, Convener, I note that in written submissions, organisations have recommended that we use this bill to bring forward provisions to suspend payments. I'm very mindful of the reduced stage 2 period, and will only bring forward amendments that carry very, very broad support, not just within stakeholder organisations but across the Parliament. However, I am minded to do so on this area. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And I think you said yourself within your opening comments that it's an expedited process, and that you understand why. And indeed, there was broad agreement in relation to that from witnesses we heard in the first panel. As you to maybe get some thoughts on the consultation that there has been in relation to this, because it's not been a kind of normal consultation you can anticipate with primary legislation. Some of that consultation has been confidential or managed consultations, if you like, for example, in relation to terminal illness, when clinical guidance or terminal illness has been consulted. So there's some consultation in relation to that already. it was very much a judicial stakeholder consultation in relation to measures on tribunals. But I would note that we're aware there's been a general conversation and dialogue with various organisations such as Citizens Advice, where there's been like some of the issues and content within this bill, but still no set formal consultation. Some of those have been, I think, as Parkinson's UK put it in their submission to us, have been a kind of a managed consultation process as opposed to an open one. And that might just be where we are because of the truncated period we're considering this bill in. But I think it's reasonable to ask you how you feel, Cabinet Secretary, you have been able to engage with stakeholders on the specific measures within this bill.
Certainly, Convener. Well, there's a number of different types to this bill. So the consultation has varied depending on the types of the the types of the parts of the bill that we're talking about. So I would suggest on fraud, for example, we've had a great deal of consultation on fraud for the 2018 Act and the regulations that followed from it, as well as the guidance. So there's been a great deal of consultation about fraud in general and how the Social Security Scotland should handle fraud, and indeed I've been to committee on a number of occasions on this. What we're suggesting that we do with regards to fraud in this bill is to replicate what we've done in the past. So I would feel that the consultation that we've done on fraud really follows on, and I would also suggest a lot of the work for the cross-cutting measures, not just about fraud, also relate back to what we've previously done within consultations again. So we're not suggesting a new way of doing things for the cross-cutting measures. You quite rightly point out that with regards to terminal illness and withholding information, that was done through the Chief Medical Officer's guidance consultation, which is a managed consultation because it is there to support medical practitioners at that point. However, also within that were a number of stakeholder groups who were invited to contribute, and the list of consultees resulting in responses being sought from over 220. On tribunal memberships, yes, we've spoken to the Courts and Tribunal Service, President of Scottish Tribunals and the Senior President of Tribunals, and have done a great deal of close stakeholder engagement about how they feel we need to move forward on that. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what we've taken place, as well as what we do on a very regular basis on other aspects around the informal engagement that myself and officials have very regularly with stakeholders on that. So hopefully that gives a flavour of the consultation that has taken place on these issues.
Cabinet Secretary, and we now move to Tom Arthur, MSP.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. My question relates to the top-up assistance and the creation of offences. If, by means of a preface to my question, I can summarise my understanding of things as they currently stand. Sections 71 to 73 of the 2018 Act provide for specific types of offences in relation to fraud, but they are not applicable to Section 79, which makes provision for the creation of top-up assistance to reserved benefits. Sections 3 to 6 of the bill we're discussing today would seek to remedy the state of circumstances by allowing for the offences created in Sections 71 to 73 of the 2018 Act to apply by default to Section 79, while also allowing for specific offences to be created via regulations in Section 79. Can I just ask the Cabinet Secretary if that's a fair understanding of what the provisions are, what Scottish Government thinking has informed the decision to take this approach, and very specifically and a very important question is to ask whether these changes are essential or only desirable prior to the introduction of the Scottish Child Payment.
Certainly see these as essential. We have within the Scottish Child Payment a very important tool to tackle child poverty, but we also obviously have a very heavy responsibility as a government to deal with fraud where it takes place. I would again say to committee and remind committee that the level of fraud in the benefit system is very small, but it does happen, and we need to take a very tough stance against that. On that basis, it seems to make sense very much to have the same provisions as we did as we do for our current live benefits. That allows simplification. It ensures that there's no confusion about what's in. And again, to touch on a point that we've already mentioned with the convener, there was a great deal of consultation and work that went into getting us to the point of where we've got to in relation to fraud. So I see no reason for there to be a different way of doing things. But certainly, given the importance that any government should have around tackling fraud, it's not sensible or appropriate to have the implementation of the Scottish Child Payment without statutory offences being in place.
No further questions, Convener.
Okay, Griffin. Mark Griffin, do you want to come in now?
Thanks, Bob. Just briefly, just to ask if there is anything that is as urgent as the measures in the bill to make sure the Scottish Child Payment comes in on time. Are there any other parts of the bill that have the same level of urgency?
Well, this is something which has slightly changed because of the impact, obviously, of COVID-19 on the Social Security programme. However, it hasn't changed to the extent that we wouldn't be coming back very, very quickly to committee with another bill so that we could put in place the other parts of the bill in terms of how we deal with disability and so on. So while the absolute urgency is on the Scottish Child Payment aspect of it, we're really not that far behind still with the aspects that we would be talking about in the other sections of the bill. And if they weren't included now, I think I said in my opening remarks, we would be coming back very, very quickly to committee with another bill, and given the timeframes for that, we're keen to make sure that we're developing this as quickly as possible. It also therefore helps us with the design of the disability benefits to have this in place at this point, so we could move forward with any regulations or guidance in due course, because we've already got that legislative framework in place. So hopefully that suggests to committee that yes, the Scottish Child Payment is the most urgent, but quite frankly the others follow not far behind still.
Mark Griffin.
Thanks, Convener. No more questions in this area.
Okay. Keith Brown, on this area, do you have any follow-ups?
No, I'll come back on the appointments if I can, Convener, when that's appropriate.
Well, that's the next one up, Mr. Brown, so why don't you just pick off on that then? Okay, Cabinet Secretary has mentioned fraud being at relatively low levels, although today we've seen in the media apparently £1.5 billion of fraud from including organised crime in the universal credit system. I'm more concerned, although concerned about that, more concerned about fraud when perpetrated against benefit recipients. An example I gave earlier on, which Cabinet Secretary may have seen, was the very high profile case when two people were receiving benefits on behalf of a vulnerable adult who they then murdered and then kept receiving that benefit for many years. I suppose the question is, what systems can be put in place to stop that don't require somebody else to come to the agency, but require the agency to periodically look at benefit recipients to make sure they're still reaching the intended person and for the intended purpose?
Thank you. I did hear the question earlier to the panel, and Keith Brown's quite correct to point to the absolutely tragic case of Margaret Fleming in this regard. So there is an absolute requirement to ensure that we learn any lessons that we need to from that, and I understand that there's a significant case review going on about that particular case, and we will of course learn and take into account the findings that come from that. In general, there is a very important point around safeguarding measures to ensure that everyone is protected within this system. I would absolutely stress from the outset that what we're dealing with within this bill is around adults with capacity. So the importance of consent is very important. So the adult with capacity would have to give consent for someone to become their appointee and can withdraw that consent at any time. It is very important that we do look at, and this will be really carefully looked at within the guidance, around how we build in those safeguards. And we're very keen to work with stakeholders around that, because I absolutely take on board and have listened very carefully to the concerns around some aspects in panel 1, but also obviously in the written evidence. There was a suggestion, I think it was from Sam H, forgive me if that's not correct, but I think it was from Sam H, that we can use DACPIAG, our expert advisory group on this issue. I think that's a very sensible and quite correct suggestion to make, and I'm more than happy to look at how that can be done as we move forward with our guidance. So it's the importance of ensuring that consent for the adults with capacity is there, and that we build in the safeguarding measures to make sure that that's done correctly. And an important part of that, which was mentioned in panel 1, which we absolutely see as a very important part of our process, is that review mechanism, and to ensure that there's a review mechanism within what we're doing to give that reassurance to the client, to the appointee, but also to wider society, that we're taking this very carefully. This is something that will be used in very rare occasions, but when it is used, it needs to be done with the utmost care and attention to ensure that people are safeguarded through it.
Do you have anything to follow up on that, Mr. Brown?
Just very briefly, Convener, I know we're stuck for time, to say that I'm very grateful for the Cabinet Secretary's response. Just, I suppose, the issue with adults with capacity, there is still the potential, of course, for fraud there and for the benefits which they're entitled to not to be received by them, but I'm reassured by the Cabinet Secretary's response.
Thank you. Pauline Meatley.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. You will have heard the earlier discussion about appointees, and the issue about the bill doesn't seem to address the ability to challenge an appointment or resolve by dispute. Law Society have said that the power amounts to power of attorney, and therefore argue that, as you said, that the adults, the Capacity Act might be appropriate. On the other hand, the DWP system has a more automatic application of who the appointee would be. It's also suggested that there's no provision in the bill for assessing the capacity of someone turning 18 to take over on the benefits. And lastly, there's also a suggestion that there's nothing in the bill that would give detailed guidance on or statutory guidance that would be published so people would know what guidance to be used. It strikes me, Cabinet Secretary, it's quite a substantial element, I think, to scrutinise at stage 2 on these issues, and I just wondered if you agreed with that, and if you had a preference, Paul, about how you'd resolve the question of ability to challenge an appointment or resolve any dispute. So an example of that might be where there's shared parenting, and which parent would be the appointee. Would that be the person that the child was living with, or is there a case to start somebody else from making that decision? Thank you very much.
Thank you. There were a number of points in there, and I think I've scribbled down them all, but Pauline McNeill, I'm sure, can come back if I'm going to miss any points as we go through this. it is very important that we have a faith and an assurance that we can give to stakeholders about the guidance, and it's very important to stress obviously that our guidance would be publicly available, and obviously once we go through the consultation process, that's an important part, but it will be publicly available when it's finally concluded as well. On the point around the power of attorney aspect of it, the granting of a power of attorney by an individual, that operates in a very different context to the appointment under the provisions of this bill. This bill deals with appointees for children and appointees with people with capacity. A power of attorney under the Adults with Incapacity Act carries extensive and long-lasting powers granted by individuals personally that requires a much greater degree of scrutiny and protection. That's rightly set out in statute. This is unlike the much narrower provisions for appointees for adults with capacity to deal solely with the determination of entitlement to social security, which are granted by Scottish ministers with the individual's consent. So I do see these, I understand where the Law Society has been coming from, but I do see that there is a difference within that. I'm happy to given the shortness of time we have this morning, I'm happy to write to the committee with further detail about why we've chosen to do things slightly differently than the DWP in this area. I appreciate that there are absolutely some areas of the DWP that we can and we should and we will learn lessons from, but there's other aspects of the DWP system around appointees that's been criticised for a lack of transparency, for example, perhaps not actually letting an individual know but what's happening to them, or that an appointee has been created for on their behalf. So that's I think an important aspect which we probably don't have enough time to go into in detail this morning, but perhaps I suggest I might write to the committee with the reasons why we've taken the approach that's slightly different on this. In terms of the capacity turning for a child, a young person's capacity to manage their own benefit claim, this is obviously a key transitional stage for a young person, and we want to ensure that that young person's rights and interests are protected in that. We're obviously very keen to move forward in a way that protects that young person's rights and responsibilities. So we have been in discussion with other parts of government, for example, around the Office of the Public Guardian and Mental Welfare Commission for Scotland, to better understand the issues around the existing appointee systems that are in place and other forms of guardianship. And we'll work very closely with them as well as stakeholders as we move forward with this. I think Pauline McNeill also suggested that there may be an issue around suggesting that the guidance that we have is made a statutory guidance rather than it not being referred to in the bill. I'm perfectly relaxed around that issue. If the committee and stakeholders feel that that's something which would provide a little bit of reassurance, again, that is really, really important for us to be able to do that, and I'm happy to be able to, if a committee would wish to do so when they move forward with their stage 1 report, I'm happy to look at that in detail to see how that can be taken forward.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Pauline McNeill, anything to add before we move to Graham Simpson on the same topic?
I'll leave it for now. I did have one other question, but I'll let others have it.
If it's on appointees, you can do it just now. I've got you down for opening up a new line of questioning on non-disclosure in a moment.
Convener, it was just to ask the Cabinet Secretary to confirm or whatever if she feels that there needs to be something in the bill that would provide an ability to challenge an appointment, or any provisions that required in addition to resolve disputes over who. Just a kind of brief question there.
The Cabinet Secretary.
I think it's something which I've obviously listened very closely to what the panel has said on this, and I think we need to ensure that we're keeping the process as simple as possible, that we're not creating something that's overburdensome. Finding appointees, for example, is actually very difficult to move forward sometimes, but also we need to balance that with the assurance around safeguarding and ensuring that people have faith and trust in the system that we've had. I'm not sure that needs to be a point that's in the bill. If it can be done through very close working with DACPIAG, for example, who, as the committee know, give us very, very detailed advice as we move forward with these issues. It's something which I'd be, as I said, I think in an answer to an earlier question, quite happy to look forward to how we can work with DACPIAG to make sure that the guidance is as strong as it needs to be.
Okay, we'll need to move on now, Pauline McNeill. Graham Simpson, we've just about got time for you to come on appointees. Graham, you got a question there?
Not specifically appointees, but it does flow from the evidence that we heard earlier, convener. It's just a very quick question.
Well, if it's not about appointees, I'm going to move on to non-disclosure, Graham, because we've got a running of themes of questions which were pre-agreed with the committee. So can I take Paul McNeill back in then to move on to the next theme of questions?
Thank you, convener. I heard what you had to say about. Sorry, on the submission about the disclosure of health information. Am I correct in saying that in effect the decision about whether to disclose that information will be guided by clinicians to make the decision, and ministers will simply follow that and either withhold or not medical information?
Yes, Social Security Scotland will only withhold information where a medical practitioner has decided that information will be likely to cause the patient serious physical or mental harm. Now, we do anticipate that will happen very, very rarely, but it is possible that it can happen. And I think the important thing as we move through this is it's not for Social Security Scotland or indeed ministers or anyone else to second judge the call that's already been made by a health professional, and if they are, if they feel that that's the best way and the right way of moving forward with something, I don't feel it's right for the agency to second guess the decision that's already been made by a health professional.
Pauline McNeill, do you want to follow up on that?
No, thank you.
Okay. I move to a new line of questioning now. Jeremy Balfour.
Yes, well, thank you. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I suppose I wanted to have a chat about the terminal illness and in regard to the provision to extend it, I think quite rightly, beyond doctors. From my reading of the bill and from a memorandum, it seems to me that we're not defining which type of nurses should be allowed to sign the form. That will be left to regulations. And I was just wondering why that was the thinking of the government, and would it not be maybe more helpful to specify what type of medical professionals can sign this form, so that there's no lack of clarity going forward, because presumably what we're looking at is nurses who have specific training in this area.
I mean, this is something which is obviously critical that we get right, but it's also critical that we do so in a way that allows us enough flexibility to deal with changing circumstances and the health professions that we're talking about. So, for example, there had been discussions at a previous stage as we move forward with this about could you say specialist nurses, for example. But there is no agreed definition of what a specialist nurse is or the training that would be required to be called a specialist nurse. So if we get too specific, particularly in the primary legislation, we will run into difficulties as we move into the future, as things change within the health professions. So the ability for us to ensure that we're getting the right balance between flexibility in the regulations and what's in the primary legislation, I think is very, very important, and that's why we've taken the call that we have. But obviously the regulations can also discuss the skills and experience that are required to be able to move forward with who would actually be entitled to act under the terminal illness rules.
Jeremy Balfour.
Perhaps just to come back, yeah, I mean, just wanted to come back briefly. I presume within the regulations there will be a clear definition of that, and I just wonder how far down the road our Scottish Government with those regulations, and when would they be available for consultation for the committee to see? Would that be before the legislation finishes stage 3, or would it be after that?
I'm not aware directly of the timetable with which it will be. I will say that I don't think that it will be while this bill is going through, but they absolutely will be in place for when it's first required, which is for child disability payment regulations.
Anything else, Jeremy?
No, that's it, Convener, on this area. Thank you.
Yeah, and obviously you go back in later for other themes. Cabinet Secretary, can I just check? So, extending this power in relation to certifying terminal illness from doctors to registered nurses, has the government given consideration in going beyond that again? Are there any other health professionals who would be well placed to assist within this process, or maybe with additional training they could be part of this process to make it as smooth and seamless as possible? Just wondering what the government thoughts are in relation to that.
Well, the moves that we're taking forward do come from the consultation responses to the Chief Medical Officer's work on terminal illness, and that's the basis of the decision that we've taken today. The consultation responses did not come out strongly for other aspects to be added to this, and we've very much used that consultation from the CMO's guidance as the basis for our decisions on it. Now, obviously, again, if things change in the future, this can be changed by regulations, which makes it much more flexible than what we have at the moment, which is where it can only be changed by primary legislation. Simply by, if this bill wasn't enacted, then we would have to go through the 2018 Act and change that primary legislation.
Okay, thank you. There was a couple of bids for supplementaries in this area, so I'm sure you get the members to check. So we'll take Graham Simpson in a second, and then hopefully we'll have time to take Paul McNeill, and then we're moving on to the next theme as agreed. Graham Simpson.
Thanks very much, Convener. Yeah, I mean, just to go back to what Jeremy Balfour was asking about, on the bit in the bill about people who can give a diagnosis, and just to read the bill out, it says an appropriate healthcare professional regulations must provide that being a registered medical practitioner or registered nurse is a requirement. Now, that seems to me to be quite wide. Because you could have all kinds of registered medical practitioners, there are all kinds of nurses. Do we not need to more tightly define that on the face of the bill and then deal with other stuff in regulations? Should we not be clear what we mean by that?
The regulations will allow us to provide that further specification. So I go back to the policy intent, which is to ensure that people have appropriate skills and experience, that they're involved in the diagnosis and care of a patient, and are working in a professional capacity. So it's absolutely our intention to establish the clear criteria which a registered medical practitioner or registered nurse must meet in order to make this judgment.
Yeah, but I'm presuming, I mean, we're not talking about, for example, dental nurses or optical nurses. We're talking about nurses who are specifically medical nurses or advanced nurses. I mean, surely we'll be able to say that on the face of the bill.
Of the bill, because things change so much, so that the terms which the members used could be construed in different ways by different people. So the important aspect is that we ensure that we're future-proofing this, not to use the terms that might get used just now but might change in the future, and that we say within the regulations around the importance of diagnosis, care of the patient, and the appropriate skills and experience. Now, if you get that all correct, as we will within regulations and guidance, then there will be nobody that's undertaking this very serious role unless they have the professional capacity and understanding to do so. But it's important that that's done in regulations, and that's the right place for the detail of that, rather than on the face of the bill itself.
Okay, Mr. Simpson.
Could share her thinking on this as the bill progresses in a bit more detail.
Okay, thank you. Now, I had advised members we're going to go to a specific theme next. We're going to rearrange this a little bit because of some time constraints. So can I take Shona Robinson, MSP, in next, and we'll return to our previous theme as agreed after this. Shona Robinson.
Thank you, Convener, for allowing me to come in now. My question is on tribunals. If I could ask the Cabinet Secretary, firstly, what plans the Scottish Government and Tribunal Service have made in anticipation of the increase in appeals for Scottish Social Security and the further devolution of tribunals, and whether the ability to make temporary appointments will itself be temporary, which is something that the Law Society had suggested.
Well, we've been working very closely with stakeholders on this, as the committee will no doubt think we should be. That includes the Scottish Court and Tribunal Service, the Judicial Office and the Judicial Appointments Board for Scotland, to ensure that the Social Security Chamber is adequately resourced to cope with the forecasted number of appeals that will be coming forward. The timetables and plans are in place for the recruitment of fee-paid members for 2020 and 2021. This work is also being overseen by the Social Security Chamber Project Board as well, and that's to ensure the successful implementation of the Chamber and the appeals process that's associated with that. So we believe with the provisions contained within this bill, alongside the other planned work that is ongoing, that will alleviate any concerns that anyone should have about the preparedness of the tribunal system to deal with devolved social security. Obviously, the evolution of tribunals more generally is an issue that sits out with my portfolio, but the member's quite right that the 2016 Scotland Act proposed the devolution of powers to the Scottish Parliament, and that's to be done via an order of council. And at official level, there has been and continues to be regular dialogue between the two governments to work through the issues with that, and we're optimistic that a way forward can be found in that in the near future. On the aspect around whether the ability to make temporary appointments will itself be temporary, no. The ability to temporarily authorise existing judges sit in the Scottish tribunals isn't new. The Tribunals Scotland Act 2014 currently sets out a list who can temporarily be authorised to assist to sit in the upper tribunal, and the amendments provided for under this bill widens this list to allow more types of judges, both current and former, to be temporarily authorised to sit in both the first tier tribunal and upper tribunal. Given the provisions are explicitly designed to facilitate temporary arrangements, and as such we don't consider the provisions themselves required to be time-bound in legislation.
Shona Robinson, do you want to follow up on any of that?
Yeah, just briefly, Cabinet Secretary talked about more types of judges. Are salaried judges for the Chamber being considered? And if so, can you say when? And just finally, how the plans for the Social Security Chamber have been affected by the delay to the Social Security programme? Thank you.
Well, there's obviously a bigger piece of work in train, which is the devolution of the reserve tribunals, which I touched on earlier, and that work is running to a different timescale because it's not necessarily all in our hands, but in the hands of the UK government. Had that work been completed, we wouldn't have needed the provisions in this bill, as the judiciary working in the reserve system would have already been transferred. However, given that's not the case, we've moved forward in the way that we have. Even with the delays in the Social Security programme because of COVID-19, the devolution of Social Security benefits is still progressing at a faster pace than that broader work on the devolution of tribunals, and hence the reason why it's important that we move forward with the parts in this bill to ensure that we have everything in place that is required to deal with the increase in tribunal decisions that may be required as we see the devolution of the disability benefits.
Fiona Robertson?
No, that's fine, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Shona. We'll now move back to the previous theme we were going to explore. Graham Simpson, MSP.
Yeah, sorry, Convener. My question, which relates to something that we heard earlier, is just to put this to the Cabinet Secretary. We heard a call that the Act should allow for the suspension of payments. I wonder if you've given any thought to that.
Graham, I'm going to take, obviously, the Cabinet Secretary to answer that, but your colleague Alison Johnson that also had a question on suspension of payments. I'm going to bring Alison in now so we can ask both questions at the same time. I think that's only fair because Alison's been sitting quite patiently for most of the meeting. So, Alison, can we bring you in now, please?
Thank you very much, Convener. The Child Poverty Action Group, the Scottish Commission on Social Security and others have called for the bill to allow ministers to suspend payments of devolved benefits, avoiding the need to cancel the claim. And I think the Child Poverty Action Group, gave us a really nice example there, speaking about a chap called Dave and the impact it would have on the processing of his payment. Just the impact it would have on him getting the cash he needs to survive if instead of suspension being possible, we have to cancel the claim entirely and start again. And I am aware that when the Cabinet Secretary was introducing her comments this morning, I got the impression that she was very mindful of the impact this inability to suspend payments would have, and the Cabinet Secretary sounded as if this is something that she would consider amending. And I'd just like to get some clarity on that. Is that indeed the case, Cabinet Secretary?
Yes, I'm more than happy to look at this. I mean, this is something which I've discussed personally with CPAG in the past, and my officials have had discussions with them on also. So it's been an issue which we've been looking at. It is something which is a very complex undertaking. It's certainly not a simple task, and therefore the only caveat I would put on bringing anything over at stage 2 is, given that this bill is running under a truncated timetable, and given the fact that therefore I think there's a requirement to keep amendments to non-controversial areas that may hold the bill up, delay it as we move forward with further evidence, because I really need it to be able to pass so that we can start the Scottish Child Payment. I don't want to bring anything through unless we have really, really broad support within stakeholders about what we're doing and how we're doing it, and also broad support within the Parliament as well. So with that caveat that I hope Alison Johnson appreciates I'm doing for the right reasons, given that the timescale that this bill is under, then I'm very minded to move forward with this. And so it would be my intent to bring forward amendments at stage 2 to include powers to suspend payment if we get that broad support from stakeholders to do that.
Alison Johnson, do you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, just briefly, Convener. I'm very heartened to hear that. I'm sure we all appreciate that stopping entitlement can create problems around passported entitlement to reserve benefits too. I can't obviously speak for all my colleagues, but I'm sure they would wholeheartedly support such action. But thank you, that's helpful.
Thank you. Graham Simpson, that may have covered part of what you're going to ask, but I want to give you the opportunity to come back in at this point.
No, that does cover it. Thank you. Okay.
The section that we've omitted in the scene we were running through was on top-up benefits, and I had Graham, I had Mark and Jeremy all wanting to come in here. Graham, we can take you in later, Graham. I see you looking for your notes. We'll take Mark in first.
Yeah.
Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Convener. It was just to ask the Cabinet Secretary what the Scottish Government's thinking was on why they were legislating for the Scottish Child Payment as a top-up rather than legislating for Scottish Child Payment as a new benefit entitlement on its own.
Well, certainly it goes back to the importance that the Scottish Government places on the Scottish Child Payment. It simply would not be possible for us to deliver that payment as quickly as we will do if we were delivering it under a primary legislation. So the way that we're doing it under top-up is the quickest route possible to allow us to move forward with that very important policy.
Mark Griffin, do you want to come back on that?
Yep. Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. I thought that might have been your answer, and just wondered then whether the Scottish Government were to consider legislating in the longer term for Scottish Child Payment to be a benefit on its own.
Well, thanks, Mark. You've just saved me a bit of time because I was going to ask the exact same question. So, Cabinet Secretary, would be really interested to hear your comments on this.
Well, I hope the committee can appreciate my absolute first priority is to deliver the Scottish Child Payment, and I think that would be quite understandable. I think we'll see how it then beds down and how that works. Obviously, the Scottish Social Security programme is then very busy with disability and with carers as well. So we would obviously have to bear in mind that the programme isn't sitting empty or quiet, but it's certainly something we can reflect on as we see how this top-up payment's working, about whether this is indeed the best way to deliver something, but I think we're probably a few steps away from that yet.
Mark, do you want to follow up on any of that, or is that sufficient?
One last quick question, Convener. The committee's had a long-standing interest in income maximisation, and just to ask the Cabinet Secretary whether she feels that the duty in Section 53 of the 2018 Act to inform claimants of other social security assistance should also apply to top-ups, given the number of people who might be applying for the Scottish Child Payment. It'd be a good opportunity to let them know about all other entitlements that they could apply for.
Very interesting proposal that's been put forward, and I'll certainly be looking at that with great interest.
Thank you. Again, Mr. Simpson, I'm not sure if your area is now being covered, unfortunately, but the opportunity to come back in, Graham Simpson, if you wish to.
No, perfectly okay. Thank you.
Okay, I don't actually have any other bids to speak. You've all been admirably brief in terms of questions and answers from the Cabinet Secretary. Is there Anyone else wanting to come in for a question before we move to private session? Don't see anyone waving at me from my laptop, so we'll assume that's not the case. Cabinet Secretary, can I thank you and your officials for taking the time this morning to come in and give evidence, and also I think I should put on record the private briefings you've had with the committee before this point also, in the common endeavour to get this legislation through Parliament as promptly but as robustly as possible. So just wanted to put that on the record on behalf of the committee as well. Before we move into private session, I do apologies that our witnesses have to sit through this next little bit, but there's one thing that I did forget to ask members earlier on. Of course, when we consider evidence heard in relation to scrutinise this legislation, we usually then consider at future meetings what we thought of that evidence in private. So I'm just seeking permission to have the ability to meet in private in relation to consideration of evidence. So any MSP is opposed to that, could they indicate now, please? Otherwise, I'll just assume that as a matter of working practices, that's what we normally do, and that's what we'll do on this occasion. Oh, I've just had my clerk tell me, handing me a virtual note as we speak. So also, can we get agreement to consider any draft report in relation to this legislation in private also? If any MSP objects to that, could they let me know now, and I'll leave that a very brief pause just to give them the opportunity to do that. I think that's a brief enough pause, given that we normally do those things. So thank you to all the witnesses this morning, from Chair Public Action Group, Sam H once more, and also the Cabinet Secretary and your officials coming along this morning. We now move to agenda item 3. Which were previously agreed to take in private, so we'll do that now and then move into private session. Thank you.